Hi everybody, Steve the Amateur Historian, back kind of in my old neighborhood, Milwaukee-ish. And as I try to be more and more dedicated and fervent about how I do my videos, made certain to bring my little tripod thing and my selfie stick for various options on how to video, but I didn't put the thing on top of this that I actually click my cell phone into to record. So I have to do it handheld, and now I'm just stuck carrying this around because this is worthless at this point. But anyway, technically we're regarded as still being in Milwaukee. The people that live here, you know, I think for the most part have Milwaukee addresses. We're actually closer to Gladstone than Milwaukee. And I gotta say, you know, for a guy that has done more than his share of research and videos on true crime in my own backyard, I didn't learn about this story until just a couple months ago. And it's kind of surprising because I have not a personal connection to it, but a general connection to it. And that has to do with where we're heading to right now. The old high school, my old high school that I attended from 2000 to 2004. And I know on the inside it's changed a lot, but outside it really doesn't look all that different. But this is my, if you can even call it that, connection to the events of the story I'm about to tell you, which is a very disturbing case of murder. So going back to the early 1980s, there was a PE teacher at Putnam, my old high school. Her name was Ann Peery. I've heard some people have written her last name as Peery, but everywhere that's a reputable source, I've seen her name as Peery. And yeah, she was a PE teacher at the school in the early 1980s, as I just said. And on January 14th, 1982, she did not arrive at school, which was very uncommon for her. She was very punctual. In fact, she was so punctual about her job that almost immediately the school contacted her father, like to do kind of a welfare check. And he went to the house and found Ann's car still there, and found that he couldn't find her. She wasn't around as far as he could tell. He did notice there was like a bundle of bedding on her roommate's bed, but other than that, he didn't see anything really of note other than the fact that his daughter was missing. So he decided to go to the authorities and report her as missing. However, shortly after he left, Ann's roommate came home, and she noticed the pile of bedding, which was kind of strange to her, and she probably knew she didn't remember leaving it like that. So she went in to take a look and noticed a pair of legs sticking out from under the bedding. She pulled it back, and there was Ann Peery, deceased. She had been strangled. The garment that had been used to strangle her with was still around her neck. However, there was also a pair of scissors just plunged into her chest, and it was deemed that that stab wound to the chest with the scissors is what actually killed her. She did not die as a result of strangulation. So logically, Ann's roommate also fled the scene, contacted authorities, and authorities arrived at the scene to assess what had happened. And they were initially at a loss. Who would want to kill this, high school PE teacher? So even though there was no signs of assault of another variety, I assume you can deduce what I mean when I say that, you still try to figure out, okay, well, was there a man in her life? Because she wasn't married. I don't think she was seeing anybody else super steadily. I know she was seeing someone new around the time of her death, but authorities wanted to look into the men of her past, so they sat down with Ann's roommate to try to see, what guys was she hanging out? And her roommate mentioned that she'd seen a couple of different men off and on in recent times. But one of the individuals that she mentioned Ann had been seeing was a guy named Leroy Wayne Earp, who, if I'm correct, I think he's a descendant of Wyatt Earp. I want to say I read that somewhere. I'm not dead certain. Don't hold me to that. And Earp had been working at that time as a janitor here at Rex Putnam High School, my old stomping ground. And so I think that's kind of how that sort of relationship blossomed. Was Ann usually got to school fairly early, and Earp, being a janitor, he would have been here early too. And I think it was something as simple as just, it was two people here kind of early in the day. They started having coffee together, and the next thing you know, it starts becoming something a little bit more serious. And authorities, they gotta cover their bases, so they start looking, okay, who's this Leroy Earp? And they're pretty shocked by what they discover about this guy. First things first, somebody driving in that area just about a block down from where Ann lived, in the Oak Grove area, little ways. She lived kind of off in that direction from here, and about 1 block down from her house, as a person was turning their car onto her street, they saw what they thought was a 1973 Mercury Cougar fly around the corner, almost hit them. They had to swerve so that the Mercury Cougar would miss them. And while discussing Earp, Ann's roommate expressed that she thought he drove a 73 Cougar. So that's definitely interesting. But as they dug into Earp's past, while ultimately trying to figure out where he was to see if he was responsible for this case, they discovered that in August of 1965, he had, by his account, hooked up with a woman by the name of Carol Charlson. And he said that they drove out together to Washington Park, where they had sex, consensual by his claims, and all seems fine and normal. He says he drank a beer. When they got done, he told her to put her clothes back on. I don't know why you'd feel you'd have to tell somebody to do that, but... And then the next thing he knows, he's strangling her to death, which, again, Ann Peery, while she didn't die of strangulation, she was strangled. He had strangled Charlson with a necktie and killed her. And it seemed like he was trying to present this, like a lot of killers do, he was trying to present it as one of these, I don't know what happened, all of a sudden I saw red and I just attacked. And her body was discovered in the trunk of his car, so that didn't help matters for the guy either. So it was pretty obvious it was him. So this guy had kind of a strange backstory, but something else that hasn't really been reported on much in terms of this guy and his shady past was he was engaged, because again, this happened in 1965, and even going back to the 50s, this guy was engaged in all kinds of random petty crime, and he used to run around and commit crimes with a guy named Gary Gilmore, who in the 1970s would kill a couple people in Utah, and he'd end up getting executed for it. It was like one of the first executions that happened in America in like a really long time. It was kind of a big deal, and Gary Gilmore grew up kind of near the Milwaukee-Portland border, and Leroy Earp used to run around with him, and they do their thing. So Leroy Earp had a bit of a record long before we get to the 1980s. And there were other stories that came out. There was a woman that said that Earp had like broken in and attacked her and her daughter in their home. Like things weren't looking good for this guy, especially considering the fact that he'd recently been dating the deceased victim in question here. And we'll get back to Earp's criminal history in a second, but just for considering who we're talking about, a former PE teacher here, this here is where the gymnasium is. You obviously can't see through it. God, they let this go to hell. Like, they can't even keep the letters on the side of the building. And yeah, I know through this door, I think, is where you'd go. This is like kind of the back hallway that led to the locker rooms. So this is where, like, Ann Peery would have been. Oh, there's another door that kind of obscures the view. But through that door, Ann Peery, would have been walking, and her students would have been coming out, all that stuff, to do their class. And yeah, there's a staircase up because it's like a split gym. There's a gym down here, and then there's like an elevated gym floor over here. So this is kind of the general part of the school where Ann Peery would have been spending most of her time. So while the search effort is going on to figure out where Leroy Earp is, 2 days after the murder, they discover his car seemingly abandoned near Rooster Rock State Park. And Rooster Rock State Park is along the Columbia River, kind of going out in the Columbia River Gorge, a ways east of town. They discovered it was a 73 Mercury Cougar. They checked the plates, checked the information, and discovered it was Leroy Earp's car, just left out there. And in his car, they found an assortment of strange things, but namely, they found a mix of like women's undergarments and stuff, some of which he discharged onto. It seemed like he had some major panty fetish. And beyond that, they found syringes in his car that had a substance in them, and when that was tested, it was found to have a type of amphetamine in it. So this guy was also shooting up, it appears, while engaging in other things, apparently. So the general theory, it's believed, or this is what was pushed by the prosecution later, is that Ann and Wyatt, they kind of have a thing going for a while. They get to spend quiet mornings together at the school before the kids get here and all that stuff. But somewhere along the line, she learns about his sordid past, the 1965 murder, and things like that. And she maybe threatens to report this. It seems the school didn't know about this, or at least Ann presumed the school didn't know. And so she was like, she decided to break it off with him. Like, no, this guy's a weirdo. What if, I may end up dead in a trunk someday too if I keep hanging out with this guy. And she may have threatened to alert the school as to his background and get him fired. And that was the motive. That is what triggered Earp. And he went and killed her. It seems the argument might be to keep her quiet, but the fact that he killed her, kind of attacked her in a way that was similar to past things, I think that maybe was some kind of a spark, but I think there was a little bit more to it than that. And there was another case that happened just shortly before this involving Leroy Earp, and it kind of set the, more than the 1965 murder, which is already out there, it kind of set the stage for what may have been around the corner. So what happened was there was a woman who claimed that in 1981, was like less than a year before Ann's murder, this woman who lived in Salem said that she met Leroy Earp like through an acquaintance. And it seemed like he might have been getting pretty close to killing her off too, like he'd done in 1965. And there may have been some kind of, I don't know. I really don't know how to make sense of this guy's mode of thinking, but it seems like he would get close to women, be with them for a bit, act bizarre at times, and then kind of threaten them or successfully kill them off. So you may be thinking to yourself, well, wait, this guy murdered a woman. Oh, it was 1965. It was it was 16 and a half years earlier, that before Ann Peery's murder, that Leroy Earp like brutally killed a woman and stuffed her in a trunk, and we know he's guilty of that murder, and he was given a life sentence with the possibility of parole. And see, that's the problem, because you might be thinking, like, why was this guy out free on the street, like, only some 15 years later? And actually, he was released in 1980, so he only did, I don't even know if he did a full 14 years in prison. And he was released. And as early as the next year, he's threatening other women, and he's out wandering the streets. And not to knock my old high school, but this place hired him, apparently without much of a background check, where you would have discovered the guy murdered a young woman less than 2 decades earlier. But apparently the prerequisites to become a janitor at the time weren't that high, so he was just allowed to work at this school, being around students all the time and all of that. And that's unfortunately the reason why he was free, and at the time that Ann Peery was killed. And honestly, I don't know how the guy was paroled. It's astonishing, the type of people that get released super early after committing atrocious crimes. But this guy wasn't even a model prisoner. This guy had tried to escape multiple times, him and another guy, him and 5 other guys. It was like a big group. They tried to steal a prison forklift and escape prison in 1967, right after he'd gone in. And then in 1972, he was on kind of a work release thing up in Portland with some officers. He managed to con the officer into letting him go into a restroom at a gas station. I don't know how you fall for that one. And he escaped out the window and had to be chased down and apprehended again. And, later on, he was found with a knife in his cell. Like, this guy was constantly getting in trouble in prison and constantly showing signs that he wasn't really being rehabilitated. Not that prison really does that anyway for most people. I don't know how by 1980 you say this guy's not really a problem anymore, when he just hauled off and killed a woman, seemingly just out of nowhere, unprovoked. So Ann is murdered January 14th, 1982. Earp's car is found January 16th, 1982. Another 2 days later, January 18th, Earp is finally found. He was at Fred Meyer, that still stands today, near 60th and Gleason in what would be northeast Portland. And it's thought that, I get the kind of vibe that maybe he was going through some of like the women's garments and someone noticed him, and that got the police's attention. Apparently when the police showed up, he tried to hide like inside the area where the garments are, just tried to hide in there. And of course he wasn't going to get away with that. So he was arrested and apprehended. He was definitely by this point the #1 suspect in this case. And so for our sake, Earp ends up going on trial for this case. Now, most of the evidence against him was circumstantial, but there was stuff that did definitively tie him to the crime scene, and there's lots of little pieces, so I'm gonna kind of go through them one at a time. Definitely was gonna make the defense, his defense, have their work cut out for him. They tried to staked the claim that he had arrived at the house shortly after the murder, saw that she was dead, and fled thinking, oh no, I'm gonna end up taking the rap for this because of my past. So it was him leaping into his car and speeding away and almost taking out somebody else's car as he was fleeing the scene. And that's how his car ended up abandoned at Rooster Rock. He kind of sped around and was panicked and didn't know what to do, drove out east of town, left his car there. He actually said he hid in the women's bathroom for a while he was there, which I'm wondering if he was maybe doing a little bit more than hiding. And he said he actually was scared out because a women's bowling team showed up there and needed to use the restroom, and he ran out. And apparently these women gave him a ride. He was like, I guess I can't stay here, so I guess I'm gonna go somewhere. I need to go somewhere else. And so they gave him a ride and said he was very nervous and tense the whole time. He'd probably shot up some amphetamine during this time, and that might explain some of his panic. But anyway, his defense was trying to claim that he showed up afterwards, and the only reason he fled was out of fear that he would take the rap for the actions of somebody else. But here's the sitch. In terms of evidence, the prosecution was able to show that a pair of panties that were found on Peery's body that appeared to be forced onto her body after death, for whatever reason, matched a pair of panties that were found in Earp's car. Remember, the bunch of women's undergarments were found in his car. So it seems like he bought or shoplifted, whatever he did, probably, some of the same undergarments, and he brought one of those in. He would have brought one of those in with him when he went into Peery's home and forced them onto her body for whatever twisted reason. So that in and of itself was pretty damaging, while still circumstantial. Other circumstantial evidence was hairs, certain types of hairs were found at the scene that matched with his type of hair. Now, hair matching is never definitive. It's not like DNA or anything, but it's another, piece of potential evidence. There were 2 partial footprints found in the home, one on an envelope and the other on a piece of paper in the bedroom on the floor. They either were there already or got knocked down there during the scuffle that seems to have happened with Ann Peery. And I'm not totally certain if those were matched to shoes he had. And there were various blood droplets found. There was a circular drop of blood found on the floor at the entrance to the bathroom, and just various other spots. And of all of the, various little, there wasn't like a massive blood splatter or anything. I mean, the only penetrating wound was with a pair of scissors, so it was more inward than something that would go outward. There was just random drops of blood around the house at that time. And all the drops but one matched with Ann's blood, except there was one drop of blood that was found that was deemed to be type O blood, which was the type of blood that Leroy Earp had. There was also a wristwatch found, kind of mangled in the bedding with Ann. Probably accidentally got pulled off the wrist of the killer as he was, messing around with that for whatever reason. It got pulled off his wrist. He didn't feel it or didn't notice or wasn't paying attention, left the scene. Didn't even realize his wrist was bare at that time. And the type of watch found matched very closely with a watch that Earp wore. And there was actually, they said, a pharmacist who would give him meds for alcoholism, so he was drinking while doing amphetamines, said the watch that they found looked identical to the one that Earp would wear. Now again, this is pretty much all circumstantial for the most part. However, 2 palm prints were found on a mirror in the bedroom, and those prints matched Leroy Earp. So that in particular is pretty damaging evidence right there, along with everything else. And when Earp took the stand himself, he pretty much validated what people were either already thinking or what everyone thought he was going to say. He, said he never told anybody at the school, including Ann, about his past brushes with crime, but he assumed she must have found out, and she confronted him about it and said that she didn't feel safe having someone like that working in the school here. So he thought he was screwed. He was going to get busted. She was going to go tell someone. He did manage to go to the office and get an advance on his pay. So he obviously thought he was going to get fired. So he thought, oh, well, I'll get some money now while I can. And he honestly, when he went to do that, he said he didn't know if Ann had gone to anybody within the school and told them about it yet. So he thought maybe he might get busted or fired at that moment. But they gave him the advance. So when it comes to the murder in question, he says that around 4 a.m. he goes to Peery's home to see her, probably to try to convince her, at least this is his story, to try to convince her not to rat him out. He's reformed, he's changed, he's fine, don't worry about it. And I guess you could say that's probably the presumption. So he says he goes to the door, knocks on it, and there's no answer. He then pushed the door open, the inference being that it was unlocked, because whoever else killed her must have gone in, done it, and then left without even properly closing the door. And he walks around, calling out to her, trying to find out where she is, which in and of itself is risky since she could possibly have her roommate there with her at that time. And he notices that there's a light on in a room, and he goes in and finds her dead in there. And of course, he goes into a panic, knows he has to run, knows he's going to take the fall for this based on his past, gets in his car and flees, abandons his car later, so on and so forth. So he didn't really add a whole lot to the situation, but of course he stood by the claim that, first of all, he tried to brush off the whole, motive that he would have, which would be that Ann was going to reveal him to the school, which, for most people, that's kind of a meek reason to go off and kill somebody. But you look at a guy like Leroy Earp, and he wasn't your run-of-the-mill guy. So he tried to, quash that by being like, oh, it wasn't even that big of a deal. I just wanted to talk to her about it. And I didn't even really, I was scared. I wasn't violent. I was scared. And then, of course, he goes to her house and somebody else has killed her already. What a coincidence. Somebody else right at the right time to make him look 100% guilty just happened to go into that house and kill Ann. In an area that I grew up in Oak Grove. I lived in Oak Grove for over a decade. I know the area. And trust me, from 1982 to 1992, when I lived there, not a lot changed. In that particular area, there is, especially of the violent nature, there's not much that goes on. There's not a lot of crime, especially compared to the rest of Oak Grove. Because Oak Grove as a whole actually has a kind of high crime rate for its size. But that particular area, there's not just crazy criminals wandering around all the time. Not to say that one couldn't have been there, but I'm just saying the odds of somebody else in that area killing Ann Peery right at the right time to make this guy look 100% innocent, I don't buy it at all. And the jury didn't buy it either. They deliberated, according to how I read it, they deliberated less than 3 hours before coming back with a verdict of guilty in the case of Leroy Earp. Earp continued to plead his innocence, as you do, and he thought that it would be overturned. He was ultimately given a life sentence, just like in 1965, with no possibility for parole for 30 years. So he wouldn't have been able to even apply for parole until 2012. And if he even bothered by then, it seems it was denied, because by 2017, Leroy Earp was 77 years old, still in prison, and he passed away. It was deemed of natural causes. He was found unresponsive in his cell, and he was almost 80. And it was in August of 2017. So 35 and a half years after the murder of Ann Peery, this guy finally passed away in prison, but at least they didn't release him again. I can't imagine what kind of backlash there would have been for that, because there was significant backlash after he was found guilty of killing Ann Peery, and the fact that he'd been paroled after murdering someone else. Major blowback, especially personnel at the school here. They were pissed that their PE teacher was killed so horribly. They were pissed that this guy was allowed to just roam the halls of the school here, being who he was and having this just unending record of crime. And the staff here actually put a letter together and sent it to Governor, oh God, I'm gonna botch his name. Was it Atiya? Atiya. I know who he is, I recognize the name. I've never heard anybody say his name. I think his last name is Atiya. Don't hold me to that. But he was the governor. They sent him a letter wanting him to investigate the circumstances of Earp's parole in 1980 to see what went on there. Why did that happen? Was there something crooked? Why was this guy allowed to be released so early? And it's happened so many times. Serial killers have been busted and then released and gone on to kill numerous other victims. And a lot of times when they get released from prison, they successfully kill more people because they're a lot more stealthy about it at that point. They don't want to go back to prison. And it doesn't seem much was really done on that matter. The parole board was on the defensive. Just, we didn't see this coming. We thought it was this, our bad, essentially. It's usually what happens. Parole boards really aren't taken to task for some of the scum that they unfortunately often allow back onto the streets. When it's abundantly clear that these people have not learned their lesson, that they are probably career criminals. What they did before, they will continue to do after being released from prison, whether they serve 5 years or 50. Some parole boards will just pass them on through. And unfortunately, other people like Ann Peery sometimes end up, unfortunately, paying with their lives. It's a horrible tragedy, and a tragedy, again, I didn't know of. I had no idea. The PE teacher at the high school I went to, little less than 2 decades before I started here, was killed in such a graphic manner and by such a potentially notorious killer with, other murders to his credit and ties to another kind of infamous killer. This Gary Gilmore guy that I mentioned, he's had books written about him. Norman Mailer wrote a book about this guy. So, yeah, Leroy Earp never should have gotten out of prison. And Ann Peery paid for that mistake, if you can even call it that, with her life. And that is the story, the 1982 murder of Ann Jeanette Peery, former PE teacher at my high school. Yeah, very troubling story, but a story I definitely knew I was going to have to cover. I cover stories about random crimes that happen in parts of Portland that until I do that video I've never even been to before. So when it hits a little closer to home, the moment I found out about this, I knew some point I was gonna get out here on a weekend, on the weekend, Saturday or Sunday, because as I'm recording this, I know this will go live probably during the summer at some time, but school's still in session. So, my opportunity to come here and, wander around the school without catching the eye of somebody is limited. But yeah, I knew I was eventually gonna do a video about this. Just a sad, sad, unfortunate story with, some lessons to potentially be learned. And all that said, I'd like to thank you so much for stopping by. If you're new to the channel or haven't gotten around to it, remember to like, share, subscribe. You can hit my Patreon if you want to help me out that way. All those little things that help a channel grow. The link to my Patreon is in the description with this video, as well as the links to my Facebook, Instagram, Reddit subreddit, and my TikTok. And all that said, thanks again for stopping by. This has been Steve the Amateur Historian.